If you've played enough gacha games, you probably had this moment before. The story starts strong, the characters are interesting, the conflict is building, and then somehow the story just slows down. Not because nothing is happening, technically the plot is still moving forward, but it starts to feel like the narrative is just dragging its feet. Characters talk in circles, scenes take way longer than they should, and sometimes it feels like the story is doing everything it can to avoid getting to the point. You can see this in a lot of gacha narratives, whatever is Wuthering Waves, Honkai Star Rail, or even more niche ones like Girls Frontline 2. And the strangest part is that these stories often have really interesting ideas. Good characters, great world building, but the pacing keeps getting in the way. So today I want to talk about why this happens, because once you start looking at it closely, you realize it's not just one pacing issue. There are actually several different ways gacha narratives slow themselves down. Some of them come from how characters are written, some come from how dialogue is structured, and some come from the way live service storytelling itself is designed. And once you start noticing these patterns, you start seeing them everywhere. Let's start with the first place where pacing tends to break in gacha narratives: character development. In most traditional stories, character development happens across a single narrative arc. A character is introduced, they face a conflict, they struggle with it, and by the end of the arc, they are changed in some meaningful way. That entire process usually takes one story arc, maybe a single book or a season of a show. But live service games work very differently. Because the story is designed to continue for years, character arcs often get stretched across dozens of updates. And when that happens, the development that should take one narrative arc ends up taking an incredibly long time to actually pay off. A good example of this is the protagonist in Wuthering Waves. When the game first started, the protagonist was intentionally written as a fairly neutral character. They had lost their memories, they were still trying to understand the world around them, and most of the early story focused on introducing the setting and the people in it. That's a perfectly reasonable starting point for a character, but the problem is how long it takes before the starting point actually evolves. For a long time, the protagonist mostly stays in that same position, observing events, helping other characters, reacting to the situation around them, but not changing in any particularly meaningful way. Hints of development appear here and there, but the actual progression of the character moves extremely slowly. And it's only much later in the story, after many updates, that we start to see more substantial shifts in how the protagonist thinks, how they approach conflicts, and how their role in the narrative begins to change. The issue here isn't that the development doesn't exist, it's that the pacing of that development is incredibly stretched out. A character arc that might normally unfold across one major story arc instead ends up taking years of updates before it reaches a meaningful turning point. And when character development moves that slowly, the story can start to feel like it's stuck in place. The plot may continue moving forward, new conflict appear, new characters are introduced, but the emotional core of the story, the character at the center of it all, doesn't seem to move at the same pace. And that's where the pacing problem begins to show. The strange thing is, this isn't just a Wuthering Waves problem. You can see the same pacing pattern in a lot of gacha stories, and once you start noticing, you realize there's a deeper reason this keeps happening. A more recent example of how delicate pacing can become appears in the current Wuthering Waves storyline with Ahmed. Ahmed's sacrifice to seal the Trinodian Aleph 1 suddenly gives the narrative something that the earlier arcs didn't really have: a clear objective. Before this point, the story often moved from region to region without a single immediate goal driving the entire narrative forward. The journey itself was the structure, but now the situation is different. The story has established a very clear direction. Eventually, the protagonist and their allies will need to find a way to save Ahmed. And once the story introduces a goal like that, pacing becomes much more delicate. If the narrative spends too long drifting into unrelated stories or character introductions, the tension around that central objective starts to weaken, but resolving it too quickly would create the opposite problem. A payoff that arrives too early risks undercutting the emotional weight of the sacrifice that created the conflict in the first place. So the story now has to walk a very narrow line. It needs to keep moving towards that goal so the narrative feels focused, but it also needs to delay the resolution long enough for the conflict to grow. And that balancing act is exactly where pacing becomes one of the most important challenges for the next phase of the story. The second place where pacing tends to slow down in gacha narratives is dialogue, and this is probably the issue that players notice the most, even if they don't always describe it in those terms, because sometimes the story technically keeps moving forward, but it feels like it's standing still. A big part of that comes from how dialogue scenes are structured. In most stories, scenes follow a fairly simple rhythm. A conflict appears, characters talk about it, and that conversation leads to some kind of decisions or action. So the flow usually looks something like this, from conflict to conversation to decision. But in many gacha stories, the structure of these scenes becomes much heavier. Instead of moving directly through that rhythm, the conversation often expands into several different layers of dialogue before the story actually progresses. A scene that should simply move the plot forward suddenly becomes something like this: metaphor, lore explanation, philosophical discussions, more exposition, then finally the actual plot point. None of these elements are necessarily bad on their own. World building, character reflection, and thematic dialogue can all add depth to a story. The problem appears when too many of those elements start piling up inside the same scene, because eventually the player starts to feel like the conversation is circling that point instead of moving towards it. This is also where another pacing issue starts to appear, something we call narrative delay. In a lot of gacha scenes, the story already knows where it wants to go. The reveal is clear, the next step in the conflict is obvious, and the player can often see where the scene is heading. But instead of reaching that moment directly, the dialogue keeps stretching the path towards it. Characters repeat information in slightly different ways. The conversation adds more context, more metaphors, more explanation, and by the time the scene finally arrives at its conclusion, the player may feel like they understood where it was going long before the story actually got there. You can see this kind of pacing especially clearly in games like Honkai Star Rail, where conversation often lean heavily into philosophical dialogue, metaphor, and lore explanations. Again, none of that is inherently bad writing, but when too much of it appears inside the same scene, the narrative momentum slows down dramatically. The story is still technically progressing, but emotionally and structurally, it begins to feel like the story is taking the long way around every single moment of progress. And the strange part is that none of these pacing problems are actually unique to any one game. They come from the way live service stories are structured. And that structure creates the third pacing problem that might be even more damaging than the others. Because the real pacing problem isn't actually the dialogue, it's the structure of the story itself. Even if character development moved faster and even if dialogue scenes were more direct, there's still another issue that would slow the narrative down, and that's how live service games structure their storytelling. In a traditional story, the narrative usually moves forward in a continuous way. One arc leads into the next, conflicts build on each other, and the story gradually pushes toward a larger resolution. But live service games don't usually follow that kind of rhythm. Instead, the story often gets split across different types of updates. You might have a main story chapter that pushes the central conflict forward, but then the next update isn't necessarily the continuation of that story. Instead, it might be a limited event, or a character story, or a seasonal side narrative. And while those stories can still be interesting on their own, they interrupt the momentum of the main plot, so the structure of the narrative starts to look something like this: main story chapter, event story, character story, side event, and only then the next major story chapter. Instead of a continuous narrative flow, the story becomes fragmented across updates. From the player's perspective, it can end up looking something like this. A major conflict is introduced in one update, then the next patch arrives, and instead of continuing the storyline, the focus shifts to a limited event, and after that the story moves to a character episode, then another side event, and only several updates later does the main narrative finally return to the conflict that started everything. So even though the story is technically progressing, the momentum of the main plot keeps getting interrupted, and that fragmentation breaks the rhythm that normally keeps a story moving forward. A major conflict might be introduced in one update, but the continuation of that conflict might not appear until several patches later. In the meantime, the player experiences several smaller stories that exist alongside the main narrative, but don't necessarily move it forward. This is something you can see in a lot of live service games, and it's especially noticeable when the story is trying to build momentum towards a major turning point, because the tension might be there, the stakes might be clear, but the story itself keeps stepping away from the central conflict before it has a chance to resolve, and over time that structure slowly stretches the pacing of the entire narrative. But this raises an important question. If all of these pacing problems come from the structure of a live service storytelling, are they actually unavoidable? And the answer is not necessarily. A good counterexample here is Snowbreak. Now, Snowbreak is also a live service game, It releases story updates gradually, it has events, character stories, and all the same structural constraints that other gacha games deal with. But the way it handles story pacing tends to feel noticeably different. One of the main reasons is how quickly its scenes move from conflict to resolution. When a situation appears in the story, the characters usually address it fairly directly. The dialogue still includes world building and character interactions, but the conversations rarely circle around the point for too long. Scenes tend to move more clearly towards that basic narrative rhythm: conflict, discussion, action. Because of that, the story often feels like it's progressing more consistently, even though it's still released in separate updates. Another difference is how story arcs are structured. Instead of stretching certain developments across dozens of patches, Snowbreak tends to resolve smaller conflicts more quickly. Individual story segments often have a clear beginning, middle, and resolution within the same arc. That doesn't mean the game avoids pacing problems entirely. Live service storytelling always introduces some structural limitations, but it does show that the pacing issues we talked about earlier aren't inevitable. Even within the constraints of a live service game, it's possible to structure scenes and story arcs in a way that keeps the narrative momentum moving forward. So if these pacing problems aren't inevitable, why do they appear so constantly across so many gacha narratives? The answer has less to do with individual writing decisions and more to do with how live service stories are built in the first place. Traditional stories are usually written with a clear endpoint in mind. A novel, a television series, or a single-player RPG might take its time getting there, but the narrative is ultimately designed to move towards a resolution. Character arcs develop across defined story arcs. Conflict escalates and eventually reach a payoff. The pacing of the story is shaped around the idea that at some point the narrative will end. Live service games work very differently. Their stories aren't written to end, they're written to continue. And that difference changes how pacing works at a fundamental level. Because the story needs to last for years, major character development can't happen too quickly. If a protagonist completed the entire character arc in the first year of updates, the writers would need to find a completely new direction for the story much sooner than the game's life cycle allows. The same pressure appears in dialogue scenes. Updates need to contain enough narrative content to justify the time players spend experiencing them. But the story also can't resolve its biggest conflicts too quickly, so conversations expand, exposition grows longer, and scenes sometimes take the long route towards the next major development. And then there's the structure of updates themselves. Live service games don't release their stories as one continuous narrative. They release them in fragments, updates, events, character stories, seasonal content. Each of these pieces needs to stand on its own to some extent, which means the overall narrative rhythm becomes much more uneven than in a traditional story. The result is a storytelling format where pacing naturally stretches in multiple places at once. Character arcs unfold slowly because the story needs to last for years. Dialogue becomes denser because each update has to deliver a certain amount of narrative content. And the main plot repeatedly pauses because the structure of updates constantly interrupts the flow of the central story. None of this necessarily comes from bad writing. In many cases, it's simply the result of trying to fit traditional storytelling techniques into a format they were never originally designed for. And once you look at gacha narratives through that lens, the pacing problems we talked about earlier start to make a lot more sense. So when people talk about pacing problems in gacha stories, it's easy to assume the issue is simply bad writing. But when you look at these patterns more closely, the situation is a little more complicated. The pacing doesn't just slow down in one place, it slows down in several different layers at once. Character development stretches across years of updates instead of a single narrative arc. Dialogue scenes grow longer and denser, often circling around the point before finally moving the story forward, and the structure of live service storytelling fragments the narrative across patches, events, and side stories that interrupt the momentum of the main plot. Individually, each of these choices might make sense, but together they create a storytelling environment where the pace of the narrative naturally begins to stretch. And that's why this problem keeps appearing across so many different games. Not because the writers don't understand pacing, but because the format they're working in constantly pushes the story towards slower development. Traditional stories are written to reach an ending. Live service stories are written to keep going, and once you recognize that difference, it becomes much easier to understand why pacing in gacha narratives often feels the way it does. The real challenge going forward isn't just writing better scenes, it's figuring out how to adapt storytelling techniques so they work within a structure that was never originally built for them. If you enjoy this kind of breakdown of storytelling in gacha games, feel free to leave a like. It really helps these videos reach people who are interested in this kind of discussions. And if you like looking at how narrative work in games, web novels and other long-running stories, you can subscribe as well. That's pretty much what this channel is about. I'm also curious to hear what other people think about this. Have you noticed these pacing issues in gacha stories too? And are there any games you think actually handle pacing well despite the live service format? Let me know in the comments. I love to hear your perspective. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.